Welcome once again to a dose of news from the Bike Show. Brought to you from the Bike Show mobile HQ that is now parked in the southern Spanish town of Ronda. Mobile HQ sounds so much better than the passenger seat of a Fiat Ducato cab, but words, it is actually both things. There's been a tremendous amount happening on the performance bike front during the last week or so, but I think I'll start with the very latest news that also happens to relate to the smallest capacity sport bike that has been announced or rumoured or leaked or whatever applies to some of the following models. Kawasaki will, towards the end of this year, be bringing us the ZX or ZX-4R that will actually include SE and RR variants. First thing to mention is that this is a completely different model to the existing and quite lovely Ninja 400, because that's powered by a parallel twin, while this new ZX4 will get its horses from an inline 4-cylinder motor. And yes, before you smirk and roll your eyes at the thought of a 400 with horsepower, let me surprise you with talk of 79 horsepower with a bit of high-speed ram air involved. 79 horses is more than a Suzuki SV650. More, indeed, than Yamaha's excellent MT-07. It's plenty for having fun with a relatively light sport bike. Relatively means 188 kilogram curb weight in this instance, which is not too shabby. You will obviously have to chase the revs pretty damn high to get to these numbers, but that's half the fun. Actually, it's way more than half the fun, isn't it? I can see there being a sudden surge in racing classes around the world for a bike or bikes like these. It also feels a lot like déjà vu in some ways too. It might feel the same for you if you're of a certain age, maybe 40 or more. That's because back in the late 80s and right through the 90s, at least in the UK and South Africa, which is where I was doing my journalisming, these 4-cylinder race replica type models were big business, especially in an era when insurance on anything bigger was stupidly expensive. And when I started racing, I would have bought my way into this class if I'd still been in the UK, but in SA, where the racing scene was obviously smaller, the easiest thing to do was to get a 600. Anyway, I digress, as usual. Onto some details of the bike without getting too carried away with all the numbers. The important ones are a capacity of 399cc, a rev limit up past 15,000 RPM, 36 Newton meters of torque at 11,000 RPM. There's some not budget at all stuff going on inside the engine, some decent valve sizes, forged camshafts, and a decent helping of cutting-edge electronics as well. Yes, the electronics package is comprehensive for a small capacity bike. Switchable traction control, alternate power modes, 4 riding modes, quick shifter, full colour TFT dash and smartphone connectivity. The chassis is a steel trellis affair and the suspension is from Showa, with the RR getting slightly uprated versions of what appears on the single R. There's radial mounted calipers for the front brakes, as you'd expect, with some 290mm discs on which they can mash themselves. Pricing has yet to be confirmed, but what we've seen rumoured would suggest somewhere up near the 165 to 170,000 rand mark, or maybe 9 to 9,500 euros, which is a lot for a 400, but then, you know, this is a lot of sport bike for a 400 as well. Okay, let's move on to the massive Chinese manufacturer QJ Motors and its links with Italian manufacturers. First, Benelli, that has been a part of its portfolio for some years now and allows it to market its own products as Benelli's, successfully enough for its middleweight adventure model to become the best-selling bike over 500 cc's in Italy. 2 years ago, it announced a tie-in with MV Agusta, a collaboration that would allow MV Agusta to go after some of that lucrative middleweight adventure segment by basically taking the same ingredients as the QJ made Benelli and then clothing them in an MV Agusta set of bodywork. This would obviously still be built in China and sold as an MV Agusta, using China's ridiculously cheap labour that is completely happy and unionised, I promise you. Honestly. Obviously a financial advantage that very few Western companies seem to be able to ignore these days. It always feels to me like the Chinese companies get the better end of the deal though, because MV will obviously still be paying them to produce the Lucky Explorer 5.5 or whatever it's going to be called, while QJ now gets access to MV's technology. And we all know how respectful Chinese manufacturers are when it comes to the boundaries of the intellectual property rights that they get. Yeah. IP theft. Right, so now we have a Brutale with a full fairing being shown across Chinese social media as QJ's proposed entry into the 200 horsepower superbike club. The fairing does have a kind of familial resemblance with the smaller sport bikes coming from QJ recently, but look past this razor thin facade and you effectively have the MV Agusta Brutale 1000. I may be a bit of a blind old fart, but even I can see what looks like the same frame, exhaust and swing arm, but with different suppliers for the suspension and brakes. I think the idea, when they originally got together, was that this technology might reappear as a Benelli of some sort. But QJ is obviously on a rapid rise in its own right, so I don't know, perhaps it fancies a bit of flagship glory for itself. All of this, though, may now be somewhat moot, since you may remember MV recently sold a shade over 25% of its equity to a certain orange gentleman by the name of Stefan Pira. The Orange company already has a big Chinese partner in the shape of CF Moto, hence the arrival of 800cc middleweight adventure bikes from them and others from the same brand built on the back of the original KTM 790s. In fact, CF Moto itself has been the subject of some rumours recently suggesting it might release a V4 superbike of its own. How, you might ask? Well, with technology borrowed from KTM's current MotoGP efforts. When the news broke of Pira's acquisition of those MV shares, I said in an earlier news piece that he doesn't strike me, bearing in mind I don't know the man, only what I read about him in the motorcycling and financial press. Anyway, it seemed to me that he was likely to continue buying those shares until at some point he has got a controlling interest in the company. The deal has obviously been good for MV though, because I see they've just announced that they fully paid off the creditors that were threatening to close the manufacturer's doors when Timur Sardarov initially took over. So that's a bit of good news for that brand. I also noticed though in the press release from MV Agusta that the mess in Ukraine, which he was initially very outspoken about, this is Sardarov, calling out Putin for the unforgivable aggression, has now been described as an outbreak of war in the Ukraine. Like a rash or something, a little inconvenience that just happens, apparently. Quite why he wouldn't say Russian invasion of Ukraine, I don't know. Maybe his tea has started to taste of polonium a bit. In which case, fair play, I would also be talking about outbreaks of war as well. I know it's one of my favourite talking points, but I really do hope that the bottom line for so many of the Western bike manufacturers starts to include some consideration of the wider implications of being involved with the Chinese regime. And yes, it is a regime. The likes of MV Agusta, KTM and BMW and the like wouldn't think of doing business with North Korea or Myanmar or other overt dictatorship, no democracy, cult-like states, but with the allure of a, 1.4 billion potential customers and cheap as chips production costs, few of them seem able to accept that China is also a personality cult dictatorship that disappears its citizens and brutally crushes dissent. Very depressing. And I say this as a man who honourably sticks to his convictions. As a man who didn't at all just buy a small Chinese generator because it was less than half the price of the Japanese alternative. Oh no, I'm a man of principle, me. That's why I got what I deserved when I opened the package to find the generator didn't work. Karma, I think it's called. Right, chew on that bit of news. I'll be back in just a couple of days because there's plenty happening on the news front at the moment. Hopefully, I'll see you in the next rant, bulletin, moan, edition, waffle, episode, whatever. See you soon.